journey that led to a union and centuries of integration into the vibrant culture of Cairo.
Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, usually when we sit down at this table, we're surrounded by, well, stacks of papers that feel somewhat distant.
Right.
We're analyzing tech trends, we look at macroeconomic shifts, we break down these dense geopolitical treaties, and it's fascinating stuff, but it's usually happening out there. It's sort of external to us.
It is. It's abstract. It affects us, of course, but it's not of us. It's not personal.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
Today
Yeah.
is completely different. We are looking at a stack of documents that are, they're arguably the most personal thing a human being can possess. We are looking at the source code of a single person.
It really doesn't get more personal than this. We are literally, and I mean literally, reading the instructions that built a human being. It's incredible when you think about it.
We have in front of us a comprehensive genetic audit of a man named Saeb. He's a resident of Cairo, Egypt. And we have two very dense, very technical reports here.
And they are dense?
Oh, they are. One is an advanced genetic ancestry analysis in English, which is just packed with raw data, charts, scatter plots, and then the other is a genetic ancestry report specifically for the Saeb family, written in Arabic, which we've had translated.
And I think the reason we're doing this, because let's be honest, we don't usually do biographies of private citizens, is that once you start peeling back the layers of these charts, you realize you aren't just looking at Amr. You're not even just looking at the Saeb family tree.
No, not at all.
You are looking at a case study of a civilization. You're looking at the history of the Mediterranean, the history of the Middle East, and the history of Africa, all of it just colliding in one double helix. It's the story of how humanity moves.
That is the hook for me. It really is. We hear the cliches all the time. Egypt is the crossroads of the world. It's the bridge between East and West.
Al-Dunya.
Right, Al-Dunya, mother of the world. But when you actually look at Amr's DNA, those aren't just metaphors for tourist brochures anymore. They are physical realities. They're written into his cells.
It's a history lesson written in A's, T's, C's, and G's. I was looking through this data, the phylogenetic dendrograms, the PCA visualizations, and the sheer density of history in this one genome is just staggering. I mean, you have the dawn of agriculture.
The very beginning.
The very beginning. You have the trade routes of the Roman Empire. You have tribal movements from the Arabian Peninsula. You have the deep indigenous roots of the Nile Valley. It is all there, converging in one guy living in modern-day Cairo.
So our mission today is to unpack these two reports. We really want to understand how 10,000 years of migration, of history, of war and trade end up in one person.
It's a biological archive.
It is. And I want to warn our listeners.
Yeah.
We are going to get technical. We have to. To understand the story, we have to understand the language it's written in.
Yeah.
We've got haplogroups, autosomal DNA, ancient models, Euclidean distances.
It sounds intimidating, but it's actually incredibly logical once you see the mechanism. It's like, I don't know, it's like learning to read a map. Once you know what the symbols for a river or a mountain mean, the entire landscape just opens up in front of you.
That's a great way to put it. So before we dive into the specific numbers for Omer, let's set the ground rules. We have two main types of data in front of us, and this is crucial, for understanding everything that follows. Can you help us distinguish between what we're calling the soup and the breadcrumbs?
That is the best analogy to use, and I use it all the time. Okay, so first, you have autosomal DNA. This is the vast majority of the data in the report. Think of this as the soup.
The soup. Okay, I'm with you.
Right. So when your parents conceive you, they each contribute 50% of their DNA. But their DNA was a mix of their parents and so on and so on. Over generations, this genetic material gets shuffled, recombined, mixed together. It's like pouring ingredients into a pot.
So every ancestor is an ingredient.
Every ancestor is an ingredient. A carrot, a potato, a sprig of thyme. Autosomal DNA looks at that entire mixture. It analyzes the final product. It tells you the recipe of your ethnicity right now. It gives you those percentages people love, like 38% Egyptian, 10% Nubian.
So it's the blend. It's the summary of everyone who contributed to the pot over the last few hundred or maybe even 1,000 years.
Exactly. It's your overall genetic footprint. If you have a French grandmother and a Nigerian grandfather, they are both distinct flavor profiles in the soup. But, and this is the important part about the soup, if you go back far enough, the ingredients get diluted. They get harder and harder to taste.
Right. So if my great-great-great-grandmother was, say, Chinese, that percentage might be so tiny now it's barely detectable, or maybe not at all.
Precisely. The signal gets lost in the noise of the rest of the soup. But then you have another book of data, the uniparental lines or haplogroups. These are the breadcrumbs.
And these don't mix. This is the part that's so interesting.
They do not mix. That is the magic of them. They are the exception that proves the rule of recombination. The Y chromosome is passed down from father to son to grandson to great-grandson, virtually unchanged. It doesn't get diluted by the mother's DNA. It's a direct, unbroken copy.
A perfect lineage.
A perfect lineage. And the mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, is passed from a mother to all her children, but only her daughters pass it on. So it traces a direct, unbroken maternal line, mother to daughter to granddaughter, unchanged.
So while the autosomal soup tells you who you are generally, the haplogroups, the breadcrumbs, tell you how a specific ancestor got here? They're unique pathways on a map.
Precisely. They are singular lines of descent. You could be 99% Scandinavian in your soup. But if your direct paternal ancestor, just that one man, was a Roman soldier from Syria who moved to Norway 2,000 years ago, your Y chromosome will still scream Syria. It tracks that one single man across continents and across time.
And in Amber's case, the breadcrumbs in the soup tell slightly different, well, deeply complementary stories. They sort of inform each other.
They do, and there are some serious curveballs in here. I mean, there is a finding in the two-way combination models involving the Canary Islands
I saw that.
and Jewish populations that really threw me for a loop until I dug into the historical and genetic context.
I absolutely saw that. I looked at the report and I thought, is he Spanish? Is there a conquistador hiding in Cairo somewhere? But we'll get there. We have to start at the very, very beginning. And when I say beginning, I don't mean the birth of modern Egypt. I mean the absolute bedrock of this genome. I'm looking at the Neolithic breakdown in the advanced report.
The deep past, this is before everything. We're looking at chunks of DNA that date back about 10,000 years. This is before nations, before written language, before pharaohs.
And there's one number here that just dominates the page. It says Levant PPNB, and the score is 59.68%, basically 60%.
Nearly 60% of his foundational, his most ancient DNA is Levant PPNB. That is a massive, massive signal. It's the loudest voice in the room.
Okay, decipher that for us. What on earth is a PPNB?
It stands for Pre-Pottery Neolithic B.
Not the catchiest name archaeologists have ever come up with.
No, their branding department could use some work. The first builders, or the wheat people, might be better. But the significance is it's massive. These are the people who essentially invented civilization as we know it in the Fertile Crescent, so modern-day Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Syria, southern Turkey.
This is the Neolithic Revolution we read about in history class.
This is the Neolithic Revolution. Before this, humans were mostly hunter-gatherers. Small bands, constantly on the move, following the herds, gathering nuts and berries. But around 10,000 years ago, this specific group, the PPNB culture, started doing something radically different. They started farming wheat and barley. They domesticated goats and sheep. They built the first permanent settlements with these distinct square houses and heavy plaster floors.
And because they had food security, a stable food source.
Their population exploded. For the first time, you could support hundreds, then thousands of people in one place. And populations that explode tend to expand. They need more land, more water.
They spill over.
They spill over. A lot of people think of ancient populations as static, like the Egyptians were always in Egypt, the Greeks were always in Greece. But that's not how it worked. Around 7,000 to 10,000 years ago, there was this massive expansion of these farmers moving south from the Levant, down the coast, and into the incredibly fertile Nile Valley. They brought their crops, their animals, and most importantly, they brought their genes.
So when we see that Ammar is 60% Levant PPNB, it doesn't mean he's foreign to Egypt. It's not like he's 60% Lebanese.
Not at all. At this point in history, that signal is Egypt. That 60% is the bedrock of the gene pool in the entire region. It signifies an incredibly ancient continuity. It means the majority of his ancestors were part of that first great wave of farmers who turned the Nile Valley into the breadbasket of the ancient world. They essentially terraformed the delta. They laid the genetic foundation.
So that's the primary layer, the foundation. But it's not the only thing in this Neolithic breakdown. I see a couple of other significant chunks that tell a more complex story. There's Dinka at 11.46%. Now, the Dinka are a people in South Sudan, correct?
Correct. Modern-day South Sudan. And this represents the vital Nile Valley connection. The Nile is a river that flows north, but people, trade, and genes have been moving up and down it for millennia. That 11.46% Dinka signal shows that Aymer's deep ancestry isn't just looking east to the Levant, it's looking south, deep into Africa.
The African foundation. It's the other side of the coin.
It is. It shows a deep-rooted integration with populations in what is now Sudan and East Africa that goes back to the very beginning. So before the pharaohs, before the first dynasties, you had this incredible mixing event. You had the Levantine farmers coming south with their wheat, and you had the indigenous African populations of the Upper Nile moving north, and they met in Egypt.
So Egypt really acts as a funnel here. Geographically, it's where these two worlds are forced to meet.
A mixing bowl is the perfect term for it. The farmers bring their agricultural technology, the southern populations bring other cultural and genetic inputs, and they fuse. They create something new.
And then there's this third block, about 20% if I add it up correctly. I'm seeing Iranian Neolithic Ganj and Kura Araxes from the Caucasus.
This is the third pillar. So you have the Levant to the east, you have East Africa to the south, and then you have the Iranian Plateau and the Caucasus Mountains to the north and east.
Zagros Mountains, that whole area.
Exactly. Ganj is a famous Neolithic site in western Iran, one of a cluster of sites where early farming also developed. This signal suggests that even in prehistory, there was significant movement from the east. It could be early herders moving across the Sinai, it could be the spread of different domesticated animals, or maybe early trade networks involving things like obsidian or copper.
So before we even get to pharaohs or pyramids or any recorded history, before we even have a concept of Egypt as a nation-state,
The subject, Amr, is already a fusion. Before recorded history, his genome is already a complex mix of the Levant, East Africa, and the Iranian Plateau. That right there, that is the genetic recipe for the Egyptian civilization. It didn't just emerge in a vacuum, it emerged precisely because these three worlds met on the banks of the Nile.
it's like the ingredients for the civilization itself were being mixed in this Neolithic bowl. That's the ancient bedrock. It's incredible. But let's fast forward a bit. Let's jump a few thousand years and look at who he is today. Because all that ancient mixing, it eventually has to settle down, right?
It stabilizes. That's the key. Populations form, they settle, they marry each other for a few thousand years, and a distinct, recognizable genetic identity emerges from the soup.
The report has a section called Modern Breakdown and a really cool PCA visualization.
Right. PCA stands for Principal Component Analysis. It's a powerful statistical technique used to simplify very complex data. Imagine a giant 3D scatter plot map where every single dot is a person's genome. People with similar DNA will naturally cluster together in these clouds. So you get a Northern European cloud over here, a West African cloud over there, an East Asian cloud way off on its own.
And the report describes Amr as a single red dot on this map.
Yes. And the whole game is, where does that red dot sit? Is it floating in the middle of the ocean between clusters? Is it on the edge of a group? Or is it right in the middle of a dense cloud?
It says here in the distance legend that scores below 0.02 are considered a great match. And Amr scores a 0.0126 with a population labeled Egyptiana.
That is an incredibly low number. In genetic distance, the lower the number, the closer the match. A score of 0 would mean you're an identical twin. So a 0.0126 is basically saying, you are this. It means his DNA is statistically almost identical to the reference sample for an average modern Egyptian.
He also matches very closely with Egyptian Arab Muslim groups from Cairo, from Alexandria, from Giza, basically everywhere in the country.
Right. And this is the modern identity takeaway. It's so important. We just talked about how he's a mess of Levantines and Africans and Iranians from 10,000 years ago. But the result of all that mixing over thousands of years of relative stability in the Nile Valley has formed a very, very distinct signature. He is genetically 94% similar to the Egyptian reference population.
You know, this really challenges the popular idea of Egypt being constantly overrun, doesn't it?
It does.
We read the history books.
Yeah.
You have the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Ottomans, the French, the British.
Yeah.
You get this sense that the population must be a chaotic, cosmopolitan mess.
But the history books focus on the elites. They focus on the guys in the palaces in Alexandria or Cairo. The rulers change, the language of the court changes, the religion of the state changes. But the farmers, the people working the land in the delta and along the Nile Valley, for the most part, they stayed. They married their neighbors, they had large families.
The substrate remains.
The substrate remains. This low genetic distance, this tight clustering, implies a distinct and powerful continuity. The population has been stable enough to form a recognizable genetic cluster that has weathered all those invasions. Amr isn't bouncing around the map. He is firmly, unequivocally Egyptian.
So the people endure, even if the flags flying over the citadel change.
Exactly. The genetic bedrock is very, very hard to shift once it's been established for millennia.
But looking at the phylogenetic dendrogram, which is a fancy word for a family tree of populations.
Mm-hmm.
Who are the neighbors? If he's so firmly Egyptian, who are the first cousins, genetically speaking?
This is where geography comes right back into play. It's a perfect illustration. The closest non-Egyptians on that tree are Palestinian Arab Muslims and Lebanese Arab Muslims.
And I see Samaritan on there too, which is fascinating.
Yes, Samaritans are a very old endogamous group in the Levant. They haven't mixed much for about 2,000 years, so they're like a genetic time capsule. The fact that Amer shows an affinity to them just reinforces that deep Neolithic link we talked about at the start. But broadly, the significance here is that Egypt isn't an island.
Even though it has these massive deserts on both sides.
Genetically, it's land-linked to the Levant. The Sinai Peninsula isn't a wall, it's always been a bridge. A superhighway, really. So the genetics fade gradually from Egypt into Palestine and then up into Lebanon. It's not a hard border where the DNA suddenly flips from Egyptian to Palestinian. It's a gradient, or what geneticists call a cline.
Okay, so we've established the soup. He is overwhelmingly Egyptian, built on a very ancient foundation of Levantine, African, and Iranian ancestors. Now, I want to follow the breadcrumbs. This is the part that, for me, plays out like a detective novel. Let's look at the paternal line. This comes from the Arabic report, the one titled the Saeb family report.
This is where we get into the specific history of the Saeb name itself. The report identifies his Y DNA haplogroup as JHU405.
JHU405. It sounds like a license plate or a droid from Star Wars. But this tells a specific story.
A very specific chronological story. But to understand JHU405, we have to trace it backwards. We have to look at its parent, the root. That's JP58.
The report calls JP58 the Semitic marker.
Right. JP58 is a massive haplogroup that originated about 9,000 years ago in the northern Fertile Crescent. It is very closely linked to the spread of Semitic languages, which, eventually became Akkadian, Aramaic, Hebrew, Arabic, and it's particularly associated with the early herders who moved south out of the Levant and into the Arabian Peninsula.
Okay, so that's the ancient root. Then the report talks about a branch called JFGC12.
JFGC12 is fascinating. It's a more recent branch, and it's a distinct tribal Arab marker. If you test people in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, or the Bedouin tribes of the Sinai Desert today, this marker is very, very common. It signifies the nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes of the desert.
An Ammar-specific twig on this branch is JHU405.
Correct. That is his unique terminal mutation. It's the end of his particular line on the tree so far.
Now, here is where my amateur history brain immediately jumped to a conclusion. I saw Arab tribal marker, and I assumed, okay, this must be from the Islamic conquest. The 7th century Amr ibn al-As rides into Egypt, brings Islam and the Arabic language. This ancestor must have been a soldier in that army.
That is the standard assumption. It is the logical conclusion based on the history we are all taught in school. Egypt was Coptic Christian, then the Arabs came in the 7th century and it became Arab. But the report actually corrects this, and this is why deep diving into this kind of data is so crucial. The genetics don't lie about the timeline.
Because of the dating of the mutation.
Yes. Molecular clocks are very powerful. The report says JH405, his specific mutation, formed approximately 1,800 years ago. That puts us squarely in the 3rd century AD.
The 3rd century? Wait, that's 400 years before the Prophet Muhammad. That's way before the Islamic expansion. That's the height of the Roman Empire.
Exactly. This is the late Roman period. The emperor might have been Septimius Severus or Caracalla. So this strongly suggests that the Saeb paternal ancestor wasn't necessarily a warrior riding in with the initial Islamic conquest of the 600s. He, or his immediate ancestors, were likely already moving through the region centuries earlier.
So who was he? A 3rd century Arab in Roman Egypt. What would he have been doing there?
Think about the context of the time. The Roman Empire controlled the entire rim of the Mediterranean. They controlled Egypt, the Levant, and the fringes of Arabia. There were massive established trade networks. The Via Maris, the way of the sea, was bustling. There were Roman legions that recruited locally from all over the empire.
So this ancestor.
This ancestor was very likely a trader, part of a caravan. Maybe he was a Roman soldier of Arab origin. Remember, Rome even had Arab emperors like Philip the Arab. Or perhaps he was just a nomad moving his flocks between the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, and Roman Egypt. We have historical records showing that Arab tribes, like the Nabateans, were present and influential in the Eastern Desert and the Sinai long before Islam arrived.
So he arrives in the Nile Delta, a major hub of the Roman world, and maybe settles down.
And integrates into the urban population. He marries a local woman, The report notes that the surname Saeb is, of course, Arabic, which fits this JP58 lineage perfectly. But the timing of the DNA suggests a migration from the desert to the delta happened before the major religious and political shifts of the 7th century.
That is a fantastic detail. It completely changes the narrative from one of conquest to one of integration or trade. It makes it less about a single dramatic invasion and more about the natural, constant fluidity of people in antiquity.
It connects the dots between the desert and the river in a much more fluid, ancient way. He wasn't necessarily an outsider kicking down the door. He might have been a merchant setting up shop in a bustling Roman market town in the delta.
Okay, that's the father's line. The Saeb line is looking east and south towards Arabia, the desert story. Now let's look at the mother's line, the mtDNA. The code here is N1B1A swall meter.
And this is where we get the classic crossroads effect. Because while the father's line pulls south and east toward the desert, the mother's line pulls north and west toward the sea.
The report describes the N macro haplogroup as West Asian, Levantine, and Anatolian in origin.
Anatolia being modern-day Turkey, yes.
And it mentions something that caught my eye immediately. It says, this haplogroup, N1B, is found significantly in Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jewish populations.
It does, and this is a very important point. It's also found in general Levantine populations, which is key.
So I have to ask the question, because I know listeners will be wondering, does this mean Amr has Jewish ancestry on his mother's side?
We have to be really careful with the nuance here. This is where genetics can be easily misinterpreted. Genetics is rarely about membership in a modern religious or ethnic group. The report notes that a sub-branch of N1B1 is often considered Ashkenazi-specific in certain European contexts because it's very common among them. But N1B itself is much older than the diaspora. It's older than the distinction between many of these groups.
So it's not necessarily that his great-great-grandmother was Jewish, but that his maternal line and many Jewish maternal lines share a common, more ancient ancestor.
That's it, exactly. It likely represents deep shared ancestry in the Eastern Mediterranean. Think about the movement of women along the coastal trade routes a few thousand years ago. You had Phoenicians, you had Israelites, Canaanites, later Greeks, Romans, and Byzantines, all moving between the ports of the Levant and the Nile Delta.
So it's a coastal story, connecting the Levant to the Nile Delta by sea.
Right. If the father's line is the desert road coming from Arabia, the mother's line is the coastal highway coming from Lebanon and Turkey.
That is a beautiful image, the desert and the sea meeting in Cairo in one person.
It creates a perfect tension in the genome. The paternal line gives him that specific Arab identity, the tribal affiliation, but the maternal line ties him back to the more generalized ancient populations of the entire Mediterranean basin. It shows that he is a product of both land and sea.
Speaking of ancient populations, let's look at the section in the English report called Ancient Model Fit. This breaks his DNA down, not by modern country, but by ancient civilization.
This is one of my favorite parts of these modern tests. It's a relatively new development. They take samples from mummies, from ancient burial sites, from archaeological digs, and they sequence that ancient DNA. Then they can compare you to them directly.
So it's not you look like a modern Egyptian, it's you look like this specific mummy from Thebes.
Basically, yes. It's asking how much of your DNA most closely matches the sample we have from a Phoenician burial in Lebanon from 2000 BC.
And the biggest slice of the pie here for Amrar is ancient Egyptian at 38.35%.
Which, again, confirms the continuity we discussed. The largest single chunk of his DNA is essentially pharaonic. It's the local continuity from the time of the pyramids to today. That base, that substrate, it hasn't gone anywhere.
But then right next to it, the second largest piece is Phoenician at 14.25%.
The ancient seafarers of Lebanon and Syria. This matches his maternal line's northern pole perfectly. The Phoenicians were everywhere in the Mediterranean, and obviously, as a major power next door, they had incredibly close trade ties to the Nile Delta. They were the great merchants of the Bronze Age.
And then we have Nubian at 10.11%.
The southern connection, southern Egypt and northern Sudan. This matches the Dinka signal we saw in the deep Neolithic breakdown. It confirms that the flow of genes along the Nile wasn't just a one-time Neolithic event. It continued throughout the Pharaonic era. There were Nubian pharaohs, remember. The 25th dynasty was a dynasty of Nubian kings who ruled all of Egypt.
And Iranian plateau at 10.18%.
The ancient trade links again, perhaps linked to the Persian periods of rule in Egypt in the first millennium BC, or just the continuous Silk Road trade that terminated in the Near East.
And finally, about 9% combined Roman Sardinia and Roman Greece.
That's the colonial era. That's the evidence of the Mediterranean being a Roman lake for centuries.
Yeah.
If you live in a major Roman province like Egyptus for 600 years, you're going to get some Roman DNA from soldiers, administrators, and merchants.
So when you look at this ancient model, what's the story it tells you about stability versus migration? It seems to capture both.
It tells you that the Nile Valley is a corridor. It's not a fortress. You have a nearly 40% core that is ancient Egyptian. That's the stability. The farmers who stayed put for 5,000 years. But then you have this 10% Nubian, 10% Iranian, 14% Phoenician. That shows that people moved up and down the river and across the land bridges constantly.
He's mostly local, but with very significant visitor DNA that decided to stay.
Exactly. The visitors became the locals over generations.
Now, I want to get to the part that confused me the most when I first read it.
Yeah.
And honestly, it feels like a glitch in the matrix. The report calls it the 50 closest two-way combinations. And the number one fit, the best mathematical explanation for his DNA using two populations is this: 93.9% Egyptian A plus 6.1% Spanish from the Canary Islands.
Laughs. The Canary Islands surprise. It's a classic head-scratcher when you first see it. It makes no intuitive sense.
Right. Is he part Spanish? Is there a lost vacation to Tenerife in the family history that nobody talks about?
It's highly, highly unlikely to be a recent Spanish ancestor, and certainly not a vacation. This is what we call a proxy signal.
Okay, unpack that. Because proxy signal sounds like we are just dismissing it, but the computer, the algorithm, chose it for a very specific reason.
It did. The algorithm's job is to recreate your DNA using a library of existing reference populations. It's trying to bake a cake that tastes exactly like Amer. It has a huge bag of Egyptian flour, so it starts with that. But after it uses 94% Egyptian flour, the taste isn't quite right yet. It's missing something. It needs a specific spice to explain the remaining variants.
And it grabbed Canary Islands from the spice rack. Why that one?
Think about who the indigenous people of the Canary Islands were before the Spanish arrived. They were called the Guanches.
Right, the people who were there before the conquest in the 15th century.
And the Guanches were related to whom? Genetically and linguistically?
I believe. North African Berbers.
Yeah.
The Amazi people.
Exactly, the AZ. The Guanches were essentially a North African Berber population that migrated to the islands and then got isolated for over 1,000 years. Because they were so isolated, their DNA stayed very pure in terms of its ancient North African Neolithic signature. It didn't get mixed with later waves of Arabs or Ottomans or sub-Saharan Africans as much as the mainland North African populations did.
Ah, okay, so the algorithm looks at Heme. It sees a specific type of ancient North African DNA, maybe a Western or a Maghrebi drift in his genes. And it says, I need a population that looks like pure, unmixed ancient North African.
And the best surviving reference sample for that in its library happens to be the Canary Islands. So that 6% signal isn't saying he's from Spain. It's saying he has a deep Western North African ancestry, Berber ancestry, that drifted east across the continent into Egypt at some point in the distant past.
That makes perfect sense now. You had dynasties like the Fatimids, for example, who came from the West, from modern-day Tunisia and Algeria, and they conquered Egypt. They founded Cairo, actually. So there has always been movement across the North African coast.
Exactly. It's detecting the Western flavor in his Egyptian stew. It's a ghost signal from the Maghreb, and the Canary Islands are just the clearest echo of that ghost.
Okay, that solves the Spanish mystery. But what about the other proxies? The list is full of various Jewish populations. Libyan Jew, Italian Jew, Sabbatean. If I'm reading this report and I'm a Muslim guy from Cairo, I might be very confused by this.
And it's understandable. This goes right back to what we said about the maternal line and the shared roots. Egyptian Arab Muslims and Mediterranean Jewish groups often share very deep Levantine Neolithic roots. Remember that 60% PPNB we started with? The first farmers.
Yes,
Nah,
the foundation of everything.
that is a shared foundation. Both groups, in large part, descend from those same ancient populations. Over thousands of years, of course, cultural and religious barriers went up. For the most part, Muslims married Muslims, Jews married Jews. But the root, the ancient genetic root, is the same.
So the algorithm is trying to explain the non-Egyptian variants in Emmer's DNA, that 6% or so that isn't the standard Egyptian A reference.
Right. It looks for other populations in its database that have a similar ancient Levantine and Mediterranean profile. And it finds that many Mediterranean Jewish populations, who also preserve that ancient Levantine signature very strongly due to endogamy, are the closest mathematical fit for that specific variant.
So it's not saying he is a Jewish great-grandfather who converted. It's saying that genetically, these groups are very close cousins.
Cousins who share a metaphorical grandmother from 3,000 years ago in the Levant. It reinforces the shared heritage of the entire region before modern religious and political borders were ever drawn. Before there were Arabs and Jews in the modern political sense, there were just Eastern Mediterranean peoples trading, mixing, and living side by side.
It really highlights how artificial some of our modern categories are when you look at the deep time perspective of DNA.
DNA doesn't care about the passport you hold. It doesn't care about your religion. It just remembers where your ancestors lived and who they had children with. Simple as that.
The report gets even more granular, which I loved. It has these sections where it splits the ancestry into 4 parts, then 8 parts, then 16 parts. It's like zooming in on a digital photo until you can see the individual pixels.
The multi-way cocktail. This is where you see the beautiful noise of history. The big signals are easy to spot, but this is where the subtle stories are hiding.
And in the 16-way model, I started seeing these very specific tiny inputs, things like Kurdish, Sorani, Iraqi, Arab, Tunisian. Each one is just a few percent.
This is fascinating because it perfectly captures the eras of empire. Think about the Islamic history of Egypt for the last 1,000 years. You had the Abbasids ruling from Baghdad, the Fatimids from Tunisia, the Ayyubids who were of Kurdish origin, the Mamluks, the Ottomans.
The Mamluks were a slave soldier caste, often from the Caucasus or Turkic lands, right? And they ended up ruling Egypt for centuries.
Right. And the Ottomans brought administrators and soldiers from everywhere, the Balkans, Turkey, Iraq, the Levant. For centuries, soldiers moved freely from Baghdad to Cairo. Cairo was the political, cultural, and economic center of the Islamic world for a very long time.
So that 6.25% Kurdish or Iraqi input in the 16-way model aligns with the Iranian and Caucasus signals we saw in the ancient breakdown.
Yes, exactly. It's the modern echo of that ancient connection. It reflects the Ottoman, Mamluk, and Caliphate eras. If your family has been living in a major city like Cairo for 1,000 years, you have undoubtedly mixed with people who came from the capital of whatever empire was ruling at the time, whether that capital was Damascus, Baghdad, or Istanbul.
It's the metropolis effect. Cairo has always been a big city. People from all over the known world come to the big city.
And they leave their DNA. You cannot live in a global hub for 10 centuries and remain genetically isolated. It's simply impossible.
So we've looked at the bedrock, the parents, the ancient civilizations, the proxies, the imperial cocktail. I want to try to synthesize all of this. If we were to write the biography of the Saeb genome, turning all these charts and percentages into a narrative timeline, how does it look?
Let's reconstruct it. We can base it on the historical reconstruction section of the Arabic report. It actually lays out a proposed sequence which matches the data perfectly.
Okay, step 1, the very beginning.
30,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers in West Asia. It's cold, it's the Ice Age. This is where haplogroup J, the great-great-grandfather, his paternal line, first forms. These are just small bands of people surviving, hunting, gathering in the hills of the Near East.
Step 2, the big one.
The Neolithic Revolution, 10,000 years ago. The Great Expansion. These are the PPNB farmers we talked about. They figure out how to domesticate wheat and barley, their population explodes, and they move south into the Nile Valley. This provides the 60% base of the genome, and crucially, they mix with the indigenous African populations already living on the Nile.
Then we get to recorded history, the Bronze and Iron Age.
Egypt becomes Egypt. The distinct Egyptian genetic profile forms over millennia. The civilization of the pharaohs arises. It trades with Nubia in the south for gold and ivory, and with Phoenicia in the north for timber and purple dye. The soup is simmering. The population stabilizes into that tight cluster we see today.
And then the pivotal moment for the subfamily name.
The Roman era, approximately 300 AD. A single male ancestor carrying that specific JHU405 marker moves from the tribal areas of Arabia or Jordan into Roman Egypt.
This is the patriarch of the Saeb line.
The specific, identifiable patriarch. He's likely Arabic-speaking or from a related Semitic-speaking tribal group, but he's living in a Roman world. He settles in the Delta. He marries a local woman, someone who carries that deep N1B maternal line linking her family to the Mediterranean coast.
And finally,
the Islamic era. From the 7th century onwards, the family fully Arabizes culturally. They become the Saeb family, adopting an Arabic name and the Arabic language. They integrate fully into the Egyptian gene pool, mixing with locals who carry that deep ancient Egyptian and Nubian heritage for generations.
So he is an Egyptian Arab in the truest, most literal genetic sense.
It's a perfect fusion of the two distinct terms. Egyptian refers to that deep, ancient Nile Valley continuity, the 94% soup. Arab refers to that specific paternal lineage from the peninsula and the subsequent cultural shift. He is physically, biologically both.
It's amazing because Egyptian and Arab are often used interchangeably today, but sometimes people argue about them. You hear, we aren't Arabs, we are Egyptians, or on the other side, we are proud Arabs.
And this report says, you are both. You are 94% the guy next door in Cairo, the deep Egyptian continuity. But your name and your Y chromosome come from the Arabian Peninsula, and your mother's line links you to the ancient peoples of the Levant.
The expert commentary in the report sums it up beautifully. It says he is both deeply local and subtly cosmopolitan.
That's the perfect phrase. It nails it. Deeply local, he plots right on top of the Cairo cluster. If you put him in a lineup of Egyptians, he fits perfectly. But subtly cosmopolitan, that remaining 6%, the statistical noise in the data holds the entire history of the Mediterranean basin. The Phoenicians, the Romans, the Berbers, the Iranians, the Kurds.
There was one last provocative thought in the report that I really wanted to end on. It was almost a footnote, but it stuck with me. It mentioned that despite being firmly Egyptian, he shows a unique, tiny clustering with Northwestern European populations in some of the PCA analyses. It was a minuscule drift, but it was there.
Yes, I saw that. Very slight. It's almost imperceptible, probably statistical noise, but it's interesting.
And the expert who wrote the report suggests this might be an echo of something incredibly ancient. It made me think, if we dig deep enough into anyone's local history, doesn't matter where you're from, do we eventually find a map of the entire world?
I think we do. I really believe that. We tend to think of history and identity as these separate colored blobs on a map. Here is France, here is Egypt, here is China. But genes don't respect those blobs. They never have. Trade routes are essentially gene routes. Armies are gene routes.
So if you are standing in Cairo, you are genetically connected to the tin mines of ancient Britain, the Silk Roads of Iran, the gold mines of Nubia.
It's all hidden in the margins of the DNA. The noise in the data isn't noise at all. It's the history of human connection. Every war, every trade deal, every marriage, every migration left a tiny, indelible mark. We just needed the technology to finally be able to read it.
That is a fantastic place to leave it.
Yeah.
While borders change and empires rise and fall, DNA remembers the trade routes.
It never forgets.
Thanks for diving in with us. We'll see you next time.